This is smooth muscle. Now, smooth muscle is a special type of muscle. It's still extensible, elastic, excitable, and contractile, but it's not striated. It doesn't have the same histology as skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle. We find it in the walls of most of the hollow organs, blood vessels, the bladder, stomach, the digestive organs, the uterus, like all of these organs have smooth muscle. It's an involuntary muscle. You don't get to control it directly with thought. Most often it's found in layers, usually two layers, with a circular layer for constriction and a longitudinal layer for dilation. Sometimes there's three layers, like in the stomach. There's an oblique layer, and it just adds to the churning and the motility of the stomach. So the circular layers are obviously going to constrict. So if we find it in the around the lumen of a tube, like a blood vessel or the intestine or something like that, then it causes constriction. The longitudinal layer runs at right angles to that circular layer, and what it does is it ends up shortening the tube, therefore dilating it, kind of like a Chinese finger trap. Smooth muscle is what is involved with peristalsis. That's what causes peristalsis. So when we look at smooth muscle, we see a whole bunch of cells, and they're all these kind of spindle-shaped cells. They are very short. They almost look epithelial in nature because of it's so cellular and the cells are so small. There's not as an extensive amount of connective tissue. There's really only endomysium. There's just the surrounding connective tissue. When we look inside the cell itself, there's way less sarcoplasmic reticulum. But the outside of the membrane, the cell membrane, has little pockets in it called caveoli, means little caves. And so the calcium that's needed for contracting is actually pumped outside of the cell and into these little pouch-like folds, the calveoli, but it becomes extracellular. There's no sarcomeres, there's no myofibrils, there's no T-tubules. The cells are too small for that. They're much more primitive than skeletal muscle cells. When you look at it, it looks like this. Like I say, it almost looks like a squamous epithelium. No striations. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of cells. So it doesn't make any sense that there's a motor neuron going to each. So the autonomic motor neurons, the visceral motor neurons, part of the sympathetics and the parasympathetics, kind of go to the area where smooth muscle is, and instead of actually having synapses, what they instead do is the neuron has these swellings, these bulbs, these varicosities, where the neurotransmitters are released. It's norepinephrine or acetylcholine tends to be the two that are used. So it ends up looking like this. So when the varicosities release the neurotransmitter, what happens is that neurotransmitter, instead of being in a synaptic cleft, ends up kind of bathing over that whole area of smooth muscle and will excite many cells, each one separately. and cause them to contract. Now, the contraction is very similar to skeletal muscle. There's thin and thick filaments the same way, but there's a far different ratio. For in skeletal muscle, there's twice as many thin filaments as there are thick filaments. In smooth muscle, there's 13 times as many. So there's way more thin filaments. The thick filaments are still made of myosin, but the heads are along their entire length. It's interesting, the thin filaments don't have any troponin. So the binding sites are always exposed. And instead of using calcium to have the troponin move the tropomyosin out of the way to expose the binding site, what instead calcium does is it binds with a protein called calmodulin, and calmodulin is what triggers the cross bridge happening. Another thing that happens is that the filaments are arranged like a spiral. It's kind of a corkscrew, and these filaments are anchored right into the sarcolemma, the cell membrane, and so they pull that whole cell membrane in. So there's no Z disc, as it were. Instead, we have these dense bodies that anchor in, and the dense bodies are joined together with some intermediate filaments that don't get involved with contraction, just to kind of make a net-like structure. And so what ends up happening is it looks like this. It looks very much like a bag that you might buy onions in, that sort of a net with these dense bodies. And the filaments, the myofilaments, are attached to these dense bodies. And when the cell contracts, so this is relaxed, and when the cell contracts, it pulls these dense bodies together and kind of corkscrews it. It's kind of like when you're wringing out a towel. As you twist the towel, it pulls the people that are wringing out the towel closer together, and it's the same sort of thing. Now, these things don't have that same sort of responsiveness that skeletal muscle has, for the most part. It tends to be very slow contractions, and all the cells in the layer, that are kind of associated with each other, tend to contract together. Often there's gap junctions that help with it. Some cells actually are self-excitatory and will act like pacemakers. But the contraction is still like a sliding filament theory. It's the same, fundamentally the same thing, with myosin causing cross bridges and to the actin molecules and power stroke, and the filaments sliding past each other. Now, the calcium, like I said, instead of binding to troponin, binds to something called calmodulin. And then when calmodulin is activated by the calcium, it activates an enzyme called myosin kinase. And then the myosin kinase affects the ATP and causes the ATP to become ADP, and then starts that cross bridge thing going. So the ATP doesn't automatically hydrolyze. It happens in the presence of this myosin kinase, which is activated by calmodulin. We're not going to get too much into this. So calcium comes in, calmodulin, then becomes activated, which activates the kinase. The kinase causes ATP to become ADP, which then energizes the myosin head, which makes the cross bridge happen. And the filaments slide past one another. So the crazy thing about smooth muscle is it's very energy efficient. The ATPases are very slow. We don't get a fast contraction, but we get a prolonged contraction, and it takes advantage of the fact that we need ATP to unlatch it to make it so we can sustain a contraction for a long time by keeping it that way. So in order for it to relax, and actually relaxation is more difficult in smooth muscles, so in order for it to relax, you have to get the calcium off of the calmodulin and then transport it out of the cell, a little bit into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, but mostly out of the cell. So it's regulated with nerves for the most part by allowing calcium into the cell. It can also be regulated by hormones or by chemicals, local chemicals. So things like hormones like oxytocin will cause the smooth muscle of the uterus to start to contract. Now, a particularly interesting feature of smooth muscle is that they have this what's called the stress relaxation response, and then what happens is that when you stretch smooth muscle, it contracts against that stretch briefly. Then it adapts to the new length, but still has the ability to contract again. So what this allows is your bladder to fill without having to urinate, because the bladder will start to accommodate. Your stomach will accommodate. It's the reason that when feces get pushed into the rectum, the smooth muscle is stretched, reacts to the stretch by compressing, and that gives you the urge to defecate. But if you ignore that urge to defecate, if you hold the voluntary sphincter closed, then what happens is very quickly the smooth muscle walls of the rectum will relax again and now be adapted to the new length, and you need to stretch it further in order to have that urge to defecate again. When we look at skeletal muscle, we say that the optimum contraction is from 20% longer than resting length to 20% shorter than resting length. So you get about a 40% change. You from 120 to 80 is the contraction of a skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is twice the resting length, so 200% to 50% of the resting length. So really, smooth muscle will contract 150%, 1.5 times its resting length, where skeletal muscle will only contract 40% of its resting length. So there's much more accommodation in smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle, we deal with hypertrophy. You don't grow any new skeletal muscle cells. You grow more new myofibrils in the muscle cell, and so the muscle cells get bigger. Whereas smooth muscle grows by hyperplasia. The smooth muscle cells divide, increase their numbers. So you actually grow more cells. So it's a hyperplastic thing. So, for instance, the uterus actually gets bigger based on hormones. There's more cells involved. And so there's this slow rhythmic contraction. There's this stress relaxation response. Because it's so slow, it gets its energy from aerobic respiration. There's lots of time to make 36 ATPs, and it uses up ATP very slowly. Now, there's a couple of different types of smooth muscle, depending on where we find it. So one type is called the single unit smooth muscle, or visceral smooth muscle, but I prefer single unit. Single unit is when all the cells that are independent work together. Their contraction is coordinated, so they work as a single unit. There's gap junctions between the cells in the unit. They all contract together. It acts as a functional syncytium. Functionally, it acts like if it's one cell. Oftentimes, you can have spontaneous action potentials that will trigger the whole thing, so you will get this rhythmic sort of contraction. And they're arranged in sheets, with the cells actually touching one another. This is the type of smooth muscle we find in the walls of the arteries, in the walls of the bladder, in the walls of the digestive system, in the walls of the reproductive system. It's the most common type. But there's another type. There's a type called multi-unit smooth muscle. And these are smooth muscle cells that each work independently of the other smooth muscle cells. So we have them in places where it's almost like skeletal muscle. It's where we want specific movement to happen. So things like the iris of the eye, or the arrector pili muscles of the skin, which are what give you goosebumps and make the hair stand up. In the large bronchioles and the trachea, we have this type of smooth muscle. It's called multi-unit because each muscle cell works independently of the other muscle cells, and so therefore they don't act together as a single unit, so it's a multi-unit. There tends to be motor units, the same as skeletal muscle. They don't communicate through gap junctions. And that is it for smooth muscle. The rest of these slides are all about either the developmental aspects or about the some of the things that can go wrong with muscle, and so that's a topic for pathology.